Hello, everybody. This is Mark Erlenwine, principal of Staten Island Technical High School, joined today with...
Hi, everybody. Kathy Palma, social studies teacher, Staten Island Tech. Thank you so much, Mr. Erlenwine, and especially, obviously, Jeff and Zach for making this possible. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, this is really exciting. I want to thank you, Ms. Palma, and Zach Millivoy for making this possible today. So we are really lucky in having the opportunity to speak with Jeff Orlowski, the director of the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, for the next hour. We have a cast of co-moderators, which I'd like to bring on right now, starting with Zach Millivoy. Zach, how are you, Zach? Welcome today.
Doing good, doing good.
Satina Chen. And Adina Roth. Hello, Adina.
Hello.
And Julia Petrokovsky. And these are all 10th grade students from Ms. Palma's class. I want to thank you all for helping co-moderate today's exciting event. In a moment, Ms. Palma and myself, we're going to jump off of the broadcast. We're going to bring on Jeff, and then we'll allow the conversation to begin. I hope everybody who's joining us today enjoys the next hour, had the opportunity to watch this really incredible documentary over the past week or so. And I guess let's get on with the show. So join me in welcoming Jeff Orlowski, the director of The Social Dilemma. Hello, Jeff.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to hop off right now with Ms. Palma, and it's all yours, guys.
Good morning, Jeff. Hope you're doing fine today. First question we have, what in particular inspired you to make this film?
Yeah, great question. And first of all, just thank you guys so much. Thrilled to have this conversation with you, and excited to go into all of these ideas. I am from Staten Island. I grew up, born and raised right next door to where Zach lives. And I went to Stanford. I went to Stanford University for college. And my friends at Stanford ended up working in tech. I loved tech. I wanted to work in tech. My friends and I, we were building website companies, and we were thinking about building different types of technology companies. And my friends ended up continuing going down the tech route, and I ended up going down a film route and started making movies. And everything came back full circle a couple of years ago, where I started learning and hearing from my friends that worked at Google, that worked at Facebook, that worked at Twitter. They were starting to say that there was a problem with the technology that they were involved in. There was a problem with the technology that they helped build and helped design. And that for me was like a huge eye-opening wake-up call. It was just sort of bizarre because I loved using social media. I loved Facebook. I loved being on those platforms. And I thought I was getting a lot out of them. And I sort of realized there's a big gap there. So I'll leave it at that for now, and we'll go into more with your other questions. But that's kind of what kickstarted everything, was hearing from the people who made this stuff that there was something wrong with it.
I see.
And Julia, you're muted, I think, if you're asking a question.
Yeah, sorry. How long did the film take to make?
Yeah, let's see. About 3 years. These are big projects. Our first film, Chasing Ice, took us 5 years to make. Chasing Coral, our second film, which is also on Netflix, took us like 3.5 years to make. And this film was like 2.5, 3 years from beginning to end.
All right. Next question. If there's anything you could change about the film now, what would it be?
Really great question. There's a saying in filmmaking that films are never done, they're just released. Because you're working, if you're working on something for 3 years, you're constant, like we're editing, we're tweaking, we're massaging it, we do a new interview, we get new ideas, we go film more stuff, work that in, you keep shaping it, and then you go and you collect more things and you keep shaping it. There's one person who I met more recently who I really wish we could have interviewed for the film. Her name is Sophia Noble. And she wrote a book called Algorithms of Oppression. And, if you remember in the film, there was a scene where we talk about climate change, and we do a Google search for climate change. And we saw how you get different results based on who you are and what Google thinks about you. This doctor, Sophia Noble, does that same type of research around race and around racism. And she has found that there are different search terms that will yield very, very different results based on what it thinks and what the algorithms are doing. And so there's a big opportunity for another story there that we didn't know about at the time and we didn't film. But there's a book called Algorithms of Oppression, and I'd encourage people to look at that.
What was your reaction to the widespread success of the documentary?
I think all filmmakers are that you hope that your film gets seen really widely. Like you want people to watch your work and see your ideas and see your filmmaking. In this particular case, we knew it had such an opportunity for impact. And we were really, really hoping that the world would see it and would pay attention and would wake up to it. We would sometimes reference it as, what is the inconvenient truth for this subject? And I don't know if you all have seen Inconvenient Truth or not, but when it came out, it really like launched the conversation about climate change and was sort of considered the first big movie about climate change that came out. And I think there are a lot of people who work in tech who were waiting for something similar to that would just say, like, put a stamp in the ground around these conversations around technology. So I think our whole team was just absolutely thrilled and floored with the response.
Following up to that, do you believe that your movie did have a significant impact to the point that more people are talking about the dangers of social media than ever before?
I think so. And our team has been, tracking and measuring and seeing what the impact has been in different ways. So we know it's definitely having an impact. Netflix announced that the film had 38 million accounts watch the movie in the first month that it was released. So like that's accounts, that's not even a number of people, because you watch a movie with your family often, right? So we have no real sense of how many people have actually seen the film, and around the world too, right? It's not just like, in New York or in a specific place. This is a global conversation. We're also seeing politicians referencing the film a lot. I mean, our team has heard stories of different politicians referencing it on the Senate floor in different press and meetings, referencing the social dilemma, in part also following the insurrection and the riots in Washington earlier this month. People were connecting the dots between what's happening in global politics and what's happening on social media. So people are, I think, in many ways naturally drawing the connections to this issue. And I think it's so important, right? We can talk about how it influences, how the technology and how social media affects teenagers, right? That's a specific part of the conversation, but it doesn't stop there, right? This is a conversation where we have technology that affects every part of life, every part of the world, in all different aspects, regardless of how old you are. And honestly, regardless of whether or not you use social media affects the world around you. And so that's what we're seeing. And I think it's also causing more and more people to just want to pay attention to the issue.
Thank you for that insight. Next question we have: was there a general consensus among the people that you interviewed as to which platform sparked the most concern?
Great question. I think yes and no, because I don't want to go into like a comparison of which platform's the worst, right? We could definitely have a fun debate and conversation of, is TikTok worse than Facebook? Is that worse than YouTube, et cetera, right? Each of these platforms are designed for a different thing, and they yield different things from each and every one of us. And they've sort of fallen into their own niches in different ways. I think the ones that are worst for teenage mental health, as we talk about in the film, are different than the ones that are worse for political polarization and misinformation and the breakdown of truth. So part of the answer to your question really depends on what aspect we're talking about. I think the consensus that many of our subjects did point to, however, was regardless of any particular company, it's not like if you solved TikTok's problems, the world gets better, or if you solve Snapchat problems, the world gets better, or YouTube, et cetera. It's not like any individual company that is causing the biggest problem. It's that this entire system of social media has now created countless impacts in our society and our world in different ways. And that the entire business model, the way all of these companies are structured, is causing a problem. And I want to clarify for just a second there, because a lot of the problems that we've been identifying are not a result of technology. It's not that technology is bad. I love tech. We're using tech right now. This technology lets us have conversations. It lets me talk to my family from far away. It lets us FaceTime. You can send messages on Signal, right? There is good technology, but then there's also technology that is, in my mind, not good or bad technology. And the sentence that we use in the film that our subjects talk to, a lot of people said the same phrase. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And we can spend an hour just on this one phrase and what does it mean and what are the consequences there. But the really valuable part in my mind is to think about, when am I the customer? When is this being designed and made for me? Right? Like, we pay for platforms like Netflix or Zoom, or you pay for your Apple phone, or you pay for certain things that where you're the customer, you're getting something in exchange for the money. Even if that's like I have a workout app that I use. I pay a subscription and they're making something specifically for me as the customer. So you know that if you're paying for it, like, the incentives are probably aligned with you, the public. Compare that to these platforms that we don't pay for, right? We don't pay for YouTube. We don't pay for Snapchat or TikTok. We don't pay for Facebook. And by the way, they're worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Right? This is like $1 trillion industry. This is it is the richest industry in the history of money. Where is all that money coming from if we're not paying for it? Right? And how is it worth that much? Because people are paying, advertisers are paying to manipulate, and the goals and the objectives of the company and the way that the tools have been built are not actually to serve you. They're not to give you a better life or a better world experience or to actually build deeper relationships with your friends and family. They're being built around, well, what's going to keep you on the site or not? What's going to give you, what's going to bring you back? What's going to increase your session count? What's going to increase time on site? So those questions and the answers to those questions have led to the problems that we're seeing because of how they're built. I think that's the thing that all of our subjects kept coming back to.
What are your thoughts on some of the newer platforms like Parler? Additionally, do you think that big tech companies are responsible for what is posted on their sites?
Really great questions. I think my comments from the last answer, I think, carry over to, in some ways, the same conversations around Parler or other platforms. I think there's really a question around who is it being designed for and for what purpose. There are some platforms that are being born now that are intentionally not going to use advertising as a business model. And so these new social media sites like Clubhouse is one example where they're trying to not use advertising, I understand, and it's still an early company right now, but they're building with a very, very different goal in mind. What was the second part of your question?
Do you think that big tech companies are responsible for what is posted on their sites?
Yeah, so it's a really great question. I think we have to look at that question from a slightly different perspective around media and responsibility and what we have and what we don't have in different systems. So radio and television, right? Radio and television are broadcast mediums where if somebody wants to broadcast on the radio or broadcast on TV, you have to apply, you get a license. The FCC gives you a license and you have to follow certain terms and conditions, certain standards, practices, and protocols, right, for what's allowed to be broadcast if something's going to go out and reach millions and millions of people. With the internet, we don't have any rules like that. We sort of fall into this gap where the companies aren't really responsible and the public's not really responsible, so nobody's really responsible. And now we have a system where anybody can say anything regardless of what's true or not. And certain things will automatically, because of the algorithms, certain things will rise up to the surface, right? So if something gets a lot of engagement, if something gets a lot of posts, it will typically rise to the top of a comment thread or rise to the top of somebody's newsfeed. One of the stats that we shared in the film is that lies spread 6 times faster on Twitter than the truth. So if you step back and you look at this whole system, so you've got Twitter and you've got Facebook and you have all these other platforms where nobody's in charge of the content, and lies spread faster than the truth, what is that going to leave us with? Right? That leaves us with the whole system where truth basically just disappears. Truth doesn't count anymore. Truth is never going to win in a system like that. So I think that the heart of your question is, where should responsibility be? And that responsibility either needs to fall on the platforms or on the people who are publishing content. There's another phrase that some of our subjects use. There's a difference between freedom of speech and freedom of reach. And I just want to go into this for a second because I think there's often a lot of confusion around this, and the First Amendment in particular, right? So the First Amendment grants us this right that Congress will not impose upon people's speech. And really the heart of that, in my mind, is that, you can say something critical of the government and the government won't arrest you, won't disappear you, right? And that's something that we know happens in other countries. Right. So any American, anybody in this country can say things and the government won't put them in jail for what they say. There's a big difference in the origin of that law and of that amendment around if you're on a street corner, if you've got a megaphone, if you're in a public square and you're telling people a certain idea, there's only so many people that that idea would reach, right? There's friction in the system. And that's in a big comparison to what we have with the internet now, where anybody can say anything and it can reach millions of people, right? That's a different level of scale. And this is one of the questions that a lot of the technology companies are wrestling with now. What's the difference between freedom of speech and saying something and not being punished by the government or arrested versus what ideas should be with oversight or without oversight being spread to millions or billions of people, right? So those are, I think, some of the challenges that people are really, really trying to wrestle with.
Following up to that, in the film, you talked about how the legal team and by extension, the government of the United States is slow to respond to the ever exponentially increasing rise of social media.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that eventually, if enough people are aware of this cause, more laws will be put into place in order to sort of put solid restrictions on these things?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think absolutely we're going to see laws come in place. And I don't think anybody wants nor is expecting the government to try to regulate content. I don't think that's going to happen, and that's not the goal. But like we were talking about with broadcasting, we need some guardrails. We need some guidelines. We need good rules that all of the tech companies can adhere to that will bring us back towards a shared sense of truth, that will bring us back towards trust in information, that will bring us back towards just, I guess, truth in general. Because the platforms and the technology that exist right now are causing all sorts of problems in those arenas. So these are, you're asking really, really great questions. And these are not easy questions. These are questions that literally the subjects in our film and policymakers, and we're having conversations with senators and congresspeople trying to answer these questions. Like, what should new legislation look like? What would good laws look like? And by the way, these are conversations that are happening around the world. Like our team, we've been talking to members of government from different countries all around the world that are saying, wait a second, there's a huge problem here. What do we do about it? And in many ways, I think that's the role of government, right? The role of government is to protect the public, to identify problems and to help prevent those problems from getting worse so that the public can live good quality lives.
Next question we have is, were there any people interviewed that still work at major tech companies? Many of the interviewees were ex-employees, and how did you convince the interviewees to participate in this film?
Yeah, great questions. Most of the people that we have on camera are former employees of the companies. And we found that the people who were former employees felt more comfortable talking on the record. Some of them had... when they leave a company, there are sometimes contracts and papers that people have to sign that say that they're not going to say bad things about the company. So there are some people that we interviewed that had to be really careful to dance around their language, and they wouldn't say the name of the company, and they would reference, but the way that these types of algorithms work, do this. So that was really interesting to see who could say what with what levels of comfort. But there are people that we did interview that worked at the company still. Some of those were on what we call background. So they were not put in the film. In some cases, we didn't even use cameras. We just spoke to them over the phone, and we got research out of it. And we were learning by talking to some people, other executives or other employees of the companies, that allowed us to get a better understanding of what was going on. But we found it difficult. The people who still worked at the companies didn't often have the same understanding that the critics that we interviewed in the film did. And I think there's just sort of a gap, certainly at the time when we were doing the interviews in 2018, there's sort of a gap in how the industry thought about it.
That was very amazing. So on to the next question. Now, many people love that this was both a documentary and a fictional story. So how were you able to create this using both documentary footage that you recorded and actually create an actual storyline out of it?
Yeah, awesome. First of all, I love all your questions. You all are asking just great questions. So this is it's a fun conversation for me too. So your question around the documentary and this narrative story, there are a bunch of thoughts on this. If any of you have seen, there's a movie called The Big Short. And it's a film that a filmmaker named Adam McKay did. And it's about the housing crisis and the financial collapse in 2008. And it's kind of this complicated subject matter that might not seem interesting to most people, but they made the movie really, really interesting. And they explained, it's a fictional movie with actors and actresses. And there were times where they had to explain some really complicated stuff. And so at those moments, they actually broke the wall. We call it break the wall, because when somebody looks directly at the camera in a movie, so they use that technique and they started to explain for the audience what they were trying to communicate. Our team we looked at that movie as a really, really great example of taking something that was complicated and making it interesting and making it accessible. So we kept asking ourselves, what is the documentary version of that? Because this film, it very easily, you all see how there are interviews throughout the whole movie. The movie could have been only interviews, right? That would have been the easiest option. But our whole team, we really wanted to challenge ourselves, and we wanted to, think what's going to be the most creative way and the most accessible way. What's going to make these ideas come to life? And that's where this extra story came in. And our whole team designed and wrote and just invented the story. It took a long time. It took months and months and months. And we wrote multiple versions of the screenplay, and it was 40 pages and 60 pages and 30 pages. And we had a documentary, and then we had a screenplay, and then we had to figure out how do we fit these two things together. And it was a huge challenge, a big creative challenge in that process to figure out how are we going to get this to work. But it's something that our whole team was really, really proud about. And I think it did justice to the ideas. And the most important part for us was the people in the AI room. So going into the idea was what's hiding on the other side of your phone? Because each of you, whatever social media you use, if you're on TikTok or Snapchat or Facebook, you think of that thing based on what you see. But what Julia sees is different than what Zach sees, which is different than what Satina sees. Each of you is actually seeing a different thing. There are 4 different TikToks for each of you. There are 4 different Snapchats for each of you, right? And what we wanted to do is make the public understand just how different this was, just how customized it was, and how manipulative it is. And that was the idea that we really wanted to bring to life with the narrative.
In the film, was the scenario about the girl smashing the time-locked container with a fork to get her phone based on a true story? Or was it part of the general dramatization of the issue?
Awesome question. So in that scene where Isla's character breaks that kitchen safe, it was based on, right before that, Tim Kendall, the guy who built the business model at Facebook. He talks about how he was so addicted that he had to lock his own phone up. And that's actually, he used that exact device, that kitchen safe, and he and his wife would put their phones into that device and lock it up and try to keep themselves from using it. So that part was inspired completely from Tim's story. The idea of not having the willpower and breaking it was something that we just wanted to add for the dramatization. But also I think speaks to this tension that many of us feel. It's like, I have many times tried to practice better behavior around separating myself from my phone. And it can be hard, right? At the beginning for me, it was really hard because I felt like I was massively addicted to Facebook and I was using it all the time. And I actually had to, when I stopped using social media, I had to sort of replace the Facebook app with a different app. So I put a news app there instead. So on my phone, every time I wanted to, waiting in line at a store or just like wanting to check, and I felt that pull, that urge to go check Facebook. Instead, I was like, let me think about this. Why am I doing this? What do I want out of this moment? Am I just like, what's the reason for me to look to this thing right now? And I would go to news instead for a while. And that helped me actually wean myself off of it. My relationship with my phone and with social media is so completely different having worked on this movie now. And I want to just share a couple thoughts around that for all of you. Because as we were saying, like the problem that we're talking about in this movie, it's not about screen time. It's not about the technology itself. A lot of the research that we've learned, the impacts to teenage mental health are not a result of screen time, but they're coming as a result of social media time, right? That's really the thing that is causing mental and emotional harm to people all around the world. So for me, I just didn't want to have anything to do with it anymore. I stopped using all social media. I stopped using Facebook, stopped using Twitter, stopped using Instagram, and those, I kept the accounts. Right. So I still have the account because there are people that I only know through Facebook. And if I really needed to reach somebody, I could look up their contact info and get them that way. But I never, ever engage with the feed anymore. I never swipe. I never scroll. I'm much more intentional about what do I want to get out of the technology.
That's very amazing. And for our next question, there was a scene with Ben family at the dinner table was very heartbreaking, where they were actually just staring at their phones and not interacting with each other. Why do you suppose time spent on our devices have replaced quality time with our family, especially with right now where many people don't go out due to the pandemic and mainly focus on their phones for like entertainment instead of listening to their family at the dinner table?
Yeah, you're asking a really great question, and it's really tough. Lots of thoughts on this. So in the film, we talk about the addictive nature of this technology, right? And you get a dopamine rush. And this was the story that I was just sharing around my own process with social media and trying to get myself off of social media, is because I started to become aware of that dopamine rush. I could like literally and physically feel it, where you go and you check, you want to check, and then you're like, I'm a little excited because what's here? Like, what am I going to see? Right. And that anticipation and that curiosity is something that has a physical response in our brains, all of us, of humans of all ages, but teenagers in particular. It has an even greater effect on teenagers, and we won't go too deep into it, but it has to do with the prefrontal cortex, right? So there's part of your brain right now that hasn't fully finished developing. Right. And that might seem weird and sound annoying. Right. But like literally right now, your brains are still cooking and they're still baking and they're still evolving and changing. And that ends when you're in your mid-20s, and it's different for boys and girls. Right. But your brain doesn't have the ability for self-tolerance in the same way. Like it just physically isn't fully there yet. So when you want to go check and you feel that impulse and that desire and that urge, it's hard to resist that. Like we just like from the pure psychology and biology of humans, it's hard to resist that. So if you're in a situation where you're home with your family and you have this thing sitting right next to you that might give you that like that buzz, and you just know it's going to be able to give that to you, that becomes your default. Right? That becomes the thing that you look for. That's what you want to go to. It's easier, it's fun, it's good. Like you think it's doing all these things for you. But in reality, I would argue it's not actually providing that connection that you're looking for. There are a lot of, like literally, I got to meet the guy who built the iPhone. Like he was on the iPhone team. He was the lead engineer for the iPhone. And his family has a rule, no iPhones at the dinner table. And there's an exception to this rule where if everybody unanimously says, no, we want to look something up, any one person can veto it and say no. But if you're talking about something and you're like, but wait, let's look this thing up. And if everybody agrees, then somebody can go and grab a phone and you can research and check that one thing and then the phones leave again, right? That's how the guy who invented the iPhone treats the phone at his family dinner table. And it's hard. It's hard because we carry these things with us all the time. For me at my house, I have a place where I like to keep the phone, and it's away from the table and it's away from the bedroom. And it's so hard. Tim Kendall says it in the film. There are countless times where he just wanted to not check his phone, but it's late at night and he wants to, check his phone in bed. Like, we all feel that, right? But it's from all of the science that we've read about and have learned, I really personally, I try to not use my phone for an hour before going to bed, both because of the blue light, but then also because of the mental distraction, and sort of get yourself into a headspace of going to sleep. But these are really, really challenging things. And as teenagers, you're in a point in your life where that social connection is new and exciting and curious, and you're learning about the world. You're learning about things beyond your house, right? So there's this really, really deep tension that I fully recognize between how do you develop and grow as young adults into adulthood, and how do you navigate the world when you have this temptation constantly sitting in front of you. One of the things I would recommend, if you are feeling that tension and if your friends are feeling that tension, it's really hard to get off of any of these platforms by yourself, right? If you by yourself are trying to get off of one of these platforms, but all of your friends are still on it, it's going to be impossible, right? So have this conversation with your friends. Have this conversation with your closest friends and be like, hey, do we want to be manipulated by social media, right? Do we want this to be the way that we grow up? This entire generation, right? I'm going to bring up Instagram and Snapchat for a second and filters, because we show that in the film as well. If you are constantly being told that here's a photograph of me and I'm going to post it to whatever platform, but if I change the way I look, if I make myself prettier or more attractive, or I make these tweaks, and you get more likes or more hearts as a result of that, what is that saying? What is that saying to you and all of your friends? That it's more valuable to be something that you're not? That it's more valuable to change yourself into somebody else's ideas? Like, that's a messed up thing for us to have imposed on an entire generation of youth, right? Like, that should not be the way that we are assessing value or likes or who's contributing or anything like that. Like, that's just messed up. So have that conversation with your friends. You can still talk to your friends. Use Signal. Signal's my favorite app. That's the messaging app, right? You can send text messages. You can FaceTime your friends. You can do group Zooms, right? You can still talk to your friends, but it doesn't need to go through something that's trying to manipulate you for their business model, right? That's something that you can fight back and resist, no problem. But it's easier if you're doing it with your friends together.
Do you think that this documentary was successful in opening the eyes of people to the issue of social media?
I hope so, right? Just this conversation, just the really, really great questions that all of you are asking. I'm curious, like, do you think you would have been asking these questions a year ago? Would you have been talking about this in this way? We made this film to hopefully be a tool so that people could think about and ask these questions and criticize something that's come into our lives in a way that we need to be critical about. Some people say, they try to frame technology as this inevitable march. It's like, oh, but technology will continue to evolve in a particular way. And that's crazy. Like, the technology is being built and designed by people. Those people are making decisions based on different values. Some of the technology that I was referencing, Signal, is a nonprofit. That's a nonprofit making a messaging platform for all of us to use. That's Wikipedia as well. Wikipedia is a nonprofit, right? You don't see misinformation going viral, causing harm via Wikipedia entries. Like, I'm sure there's a bunch of bad stuff that's happening on the platform, but it's not at the level of changing or propagating out misinformation to millions of people. What we see happening from social media, these are for-profit companies. They made something that made them a lot of money. I mean, some of the richest people in the world, right, are the result of making this type of technology that's been able to exploit all of us. Shoshana Zuboff, I'm going to go wonky for just a second here, because there's a woman in the film, Shoshana Zuboff, and she wrote this book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And that's a really complicated idea, surveillance capitalism. But the concept really is that there are a whole bunch of companies who make their money off of surveilling us, collecting data about us, right? And she makes this comparison that I think is a really important one. And it's one that ties in with another big issue, climate change, where we have companies that exist in this world and in this country that make their money off of taking things out of the planet, right? So extractive industries, right? So these companies drill things out of the ground, and they figured out how to make money drilling things out of the ground and burning them and selling them, right? That's the entire business. And they've made a lot of money. And we now know that that process is bad for humanity. And that industry wants to keep it going because it makes them a lot of money. But then the environmentalists and lobbyists and legislators are saying, but no, this is really, really bad for the world and for society. So there's a tension that exists now between these companies that want to make money versus the literal destruction of civilization, right? Like, that's what we're dealing with. These social media companies do that same exact thing, but instead of drilling into the planet, they're not extracting oil. They're extracting Julia. They're extracting Zach. They're extracting Adina. They have figured out how to collect you and turn you into data. The little avatar that we use in the movie, this model, it's a metaphor, but it's a metaphor based on what's actually literally happening for every single company out there. Instagram has a model of you. TikTok and Snapchat and Google and Facebook and Twitter all have a model of you where they are collecting everything that you do, every interaction, where you go, what you click, what you don't click. All of that gets turned into this little model, and they're testing that model all the time. Like, what's going to keep Zach on today? Like, what's going to get another scroll? Does Zach engage with this or does Zach not engage with it? And that's constantly what they're asking, because that's what makes them money, right? So our lives and our experiences have been turned into this thing that some of you might be too young to have seen the movie The Matrix. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to watch it. It came out a while ago, but it's a concept and it's an analogy that we use in the film, sort of at the end of the film when we scale back and you see Ben's character, this little avatar sitting in this box, but it's one box of many, many boxes, and that all of us are plugged into the system. That metaphor is true. Like, it is real life. That's what's going on right now. We are living in the Matrix. And I think it's something that has, honestly, it's frightened me. And it's frightened me for what the future will look like if we allow these systems to continue like this. Sorry, I'm going like super deep and heavy, but this is like what we're dealing with. This is what your generation is going to be dealing with. Either you're going to become adults and grow up into a world where you're being completely puppeteered by somebody else's financial interests, or you're going to somehow figure out a way to fight back, maintain your own independent authority and decision-making, right? And this decision-making and free will is another whole part of this conversation, because one of the things that we learned from one of our subjects, Kathy O'Neill, she wrote a book called Weapons of Math Destruction, which I love that title. But she says algorithms don't predict the future, they cause the future. And that can sound super sci-fi and out there and kind of crazy, but it's actually true when you understand how the algorithms work. They are causing, they take data and they make predictions happen as a result of it, and it ends up reinforcing what was fed into it. And so, are you going to be your own autonomous free will agents determining your own futures, or are you going to let algorithms dictate the paths for you?
That was very amazing. So, one of the greatest points is in the documentary, some interviewees gave tips on how to avoid spending so much time on social media and devices in general. For example, one of those tips which I've been starting to integrate into my daily life is turning off notifications. Now, what were some of the biggest takeaways that you feel or hoped were the most important messages that the viewers should walk away from viewing your movie, The Social Dilemma?
Yeah, awesome. I'll rattle off a whole bunch of stuff right now, and I hope somebody's taking notes out there. I'm just going to spitball a bunch of things. The notifications is a great starting point, right? And I leave notifications on from people. So I let text messages come through, or I let signal messages come through where I need to respond to somebody, but I don't let notifications come through from the platforms. And I've stopped using social media, as I've said, but I don't let news notifications come through. I don't let the platforms come through. I don't want anybody pinging me to try to get me to come back to their thing, right? So that's the first thing. Other lessons learned as we were sharing, like, if you can get off of social media, get off of social media. Like, it increased my capacity and creativity in life. Am I going to spend my time mindlessly scrolling? Like, is that going to be just look at your screen time. How much time are you spending of your life scrolling on these apps? Multiply that out by how many years you're going to live. Like, do you want to spend that many days and months and years of your life just like mindlessly scrolling? For what purpose, right? Or are you going to spend your time increasing who you are, being the best version of yourself? Are you going to learn something? Like, read a book, think critical thoughts. Like, you have these options around where your time goes. And you're at the stage right now in your life where you're getting more and more control and awareness over where your time is going to go. And who do you want to be when you grow up, right? Those are options for each and every one of you. So do you need social media as part of that equation? I would question that, and I would challenge that. As I was sharing, like, I try to keep myself away from my phone if I can, and I use it intentionally. We used to, I'm just going to reference, like, back in the old days when there was only one computer in a house, we did something that was called batch processing. That, I would go to my desktop computer once a day to check emails, and I would do all the emails, and then I'd be done with emails, and you'd go about living your life again. But now when you have this device with you all the time, where you're just seeing everything coming in all the time, it constantly breaks up your mental focus. One of the things that we learned in this film is that the idea of multitasking is a complete fallacy. Like, you can't actually multitask. Nobody can multitask. What's actually happening is that you're doing serial monotasking. You have to switch from one focused attention to the next, to the next, to the next. And there's a thing called context switching, right? We lose the ability to keep focus if you're constantly switching between different things. So the greatest way to use your time is to, like, clear your desk, clear your time, clear your schedule, and focus deeply for a half hour or something on one subject, one idea, and think deeply about that. And then you move on to the next thing. I mean, just if you think about, like, anytime you've had to write an essay, how can you actually get through writing a whole essay if you're constantly being pinged and getting a notification and being distracted? It is, like, absolutely impossible, right? So for me, the only way we were able to make this movie is because at the time I was realizing how much I was being distracted by all this stuff all the time, and I actively pushed it away. So I can sit with just my word processor, with this special screenwriting software that we use. All the notifications are off. My phone's in a different room. It's just me and this one screen, and I can think deeply and clearly about that one focused thing, and then move on to the next thing when you're done. Those are just a couple of quick little things there. But I guess a couple other things too, like we said, try to do phone-free dinners with your family. You can be the one that encourages it. Another big part of this problem is probably your parents, who are equally addicted to whatever social media they like, and they're the ones modeling the same behaviors, and they come home and the first thing they're doing is they're checking their phone, and their phone's out all the time. You also have the power to tell them, hey, look, I don't want this to be what we do in our house, right? And maybe the whole family puts your phones in a certain spot, and you can have real conversations again.
What can big tech do to address how social media contributes to our narrowing attention spans and use of social media in favor of deliberately looking for evidence-backed information instead?
Awesome question. Really, really great question. Thanks, Satina. So there's a lot in your question there, and I don't want to go too complicated with it, but your question was around big tech. And as we're talking here, in my mind, a lot of the problems are coming out of big social. So Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and TikTok, et cetera, right? So the social platforms are where I think we're seeing a lot of the problems that you're talking about. But interestingly, some of the other tech companies have the power to regulate some of this. And we're starting to see that. We're starting to see Apple say, no, we don't want this on our platform. And Apple's trying to use its power to regulate what goes through some of the platforms that go onto the Apple operating system. So there are hopes and opportunities for some of the other companies in the space to say, this is not how we want to do things. But I think one of the big challenges is that what we're talking about here is a complete rewriting of Facebook. It's a complete rewriting of Twitter. It's basically at the level like throw it out and start over again because your business model is bad, right? Just like burning fossil fuels is a bad business model for planet Earth, right? We have to figure out how to stop burning fossil fuels. So all of the companies whose business is to burn fossil fuels are threatened. That's the level of conversation that we're having with Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, that the fundamental way they're designed is problematic. And it's going to be a really, really tough one to change.
Now, for our last question, how do you propose that we as a society shift our focus away from social media and technology when the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to turn remote and to online versions of schooling, communications, entertainment, and so much more?
Yep. Yeah, great question. And I think we were hinting on some of these themes throughout the conversation today, but separate out bad technology from good technology, right? When is the technology designed for us? This is not an anti-technology conversation. It's a critique of what social media and big social are doing to all of us. So as we're home, right, you can still connect with your friends and family on messaging apps. You can still connect with your friends and family on FaceTime, right? You can use Zoom for conversations. There's great applications for what the technology can do that don't have the manipulative consequences. That's really, in many ways, the first starting point. But there are more and more real, like Zoom fatigue is a real thing. Sitting in front of, I spend so much time sitting in front of this computer screen, right? Like that's a lot of my life right now. But I also cherish, when can I just take a phone call and walk around the block? And when can I get outside? And when can I do things that are with family, with friends, in a safe way, that are in a COVID safe way, that still allow us to live meaningful, fruitful lives, right? So just asking those questions around, when is the technology designed for you versus when is it designed for some other goal? And I think advertising is one way to see where that difference exists. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
All right. I have a few more questions for you, Jeff. The first one, regardless of the business's incentive to do this, because as you know, and as you discussed in the documentary, they probably would never agree to like the implication I have in this question. But is it possible for these companies to completely overhaul their algorithms, completely overhaul their layout to induce less addictive effects, to promote safe news spreading, to promote just a better, as you said in the movie, more of a tool than an actual something that grabs your attention?
Really great question. And I think the core to the answer to your question is, of course, absolutely they can, but they're choosing not to. And this is really the big tension and the big conflict that I think is so evident for what they value, right? Because they're valuing money over your quality of life. A couple thoughts on this. So there was just some research that came out in the New York Times in November, December, from some tech reporters who have been covering Facebook for a long time. And they found that Facebook was trying to research internally content that they called good for the world or bad for the world. And they had people label, is this good for the world or bad for the world? And unfortunately, they found that a lot of the things that were bad for the world were things that were very, very popular and went very virally. And what they did, they tested, okay, can we scale back spreading the stuff that's bad for the world? And they toned it down. They like found that type of stuff and they used the algorithm to tone down what's bad for the world. And what they discovered is that it resulted in people spending less time on Facebook, fewer sessions, right? So the people went back to Facebook less frequently. And then the executive said like, no, like that's not good. Like that's a bad thing for us. We need to keep session time up. So they literally took that dial and they like undid it. And they're like, okay, let's bring back that stuff that's bad for the world a little bit more. And they found this balance where they like minimized bad stuff for the world, but they didn't decrease the sessions. And it kept the session count at that same height. The fact that that's how they're doing this calculation is so messed up, right? Literally, they have a dial that says what's good for the world and what's bad for the world. And they can bring down the things that are bad for the world, but they didn't stop it. They actively, it's like we need enough of it so that people keep using it so that we keep making money. That is Facebook in a nutshell, right? At least today. And it could be completely different. And here's one of the things that I want to plant in all of your minds. Who amongst you is going to become a software engineer? Who's going to build software? Who's going to build a tech company? Who's going to build any company? Who's going to build something out that's going to serve the world, right? What are the values that you're going to bring into those companies, to those products, to those ideas, whatever you end up doing? Where are the companies going to be? What are the companies that you're going to want to work for or not, right? If some of you wanted to work at Facebook, during that interview, ask them really tough questions. Ask them like, when are you going to change your business model? Like, how do you feel about what Facebook's doing to society? Like, put pressure on those companies and make them, hold them accountable for being better in the world. But I would even challenge you even more, like, who's going to make the next type of social media that makes people feel better after they use it, that makes you feel closer with your friends and family, that makes you feel like you have a better understanding of the world? Somebody's going to make that, and they're going to, first of all, they're going to become super rich. But second of all, they're going to make something that is providing greater value in society, right? Make something that I want to pay for, right? That's, I think, a really, really big challenge and a big question. And I think somebody is going to be that person, and it could be one of you.
Amazing answer to that question, really. I also found it very funny that in their testing, it seems almost dystopian that the more bad you increase in the world, the more money it makes. That seems something out of, what's it called? Some sort of 1984 dystopian narrative.
Exactly.
But no,
that's what we're living in right now. I mean, 1984 is a really great reference there. And I would also reference Brave New World, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And those two concepts, those two authors, had similar but very different ideas around this dystopian future, where in 1984, it was this dystopia from oppression, like the big brother and the system was like squashing life out of the public. In Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, it was a different type of dystopia, and some argue that's what we're living through now, where there's going to be so much content, so much like trivial entertainment. There's no need to burn the books because nobody wants to read the books. That's what Huxley was talking about. And so that's in many ways like the breakdown of truth that we're experiencing right now is a direct replication of that, right? Like, who can even tell what's true or not anymore? We've been flooded with so much triviality that it's just impossible to discern what's important or not. That's unfortunately the path that we seem to be on.
Now, in today's world, companies such as DuckDuckGo, a private search engine, which does respond with ads, but it doesn't have any algorithms that create a personalized avatar of the user, and Signal on the rise. Do you think that if enough users were to switch to these services, would this incentivize companies to start making more ethical business practices?
Absolutely, 100%. I think it's what we're seeing. It's a great trend that we're seeing, and I think that's the path that we need to go down, where a nonprofit like Signal is starting to like actively compete with WhatsApp and Facebook's business model, right? That's a huge shift. I'm seeing so many people migrate from WhatsApp to Signal. And Signal made it easy. Like you can just get a group link in a couple of clicks and you can get a whole WhatsApp group to migrate over. DuckDuckGo, as you mentioned, is another really great example. That's the search engine that I typically use. I use Quant and or DuckDuckGo, and I use it on Brave. I don't use Chrome. I've tried to stop using Google. I don't use Google as a search engine, right? I avoid it because I don't believe in their business model. The DuckDuckGo model, as you're talking about, is all relevant to that exact search. So it's not based on building a model and replicating it off of you. So these are in some ways they might seem like small changes, but in reality, I think they're really, really big shifts and really, really big signals where the public is saying, we're fed up. We don't want that other stuff. We want stuff that serves our interest. And I think it's sort of an indication of the beginning of the end for the thinking and the values and the approach that are embedded in Facebook and companies like that. That type of mindset is not long for this world.
And for my final question, as a person that came from the environment of the specialized high schools, what were the trials and tribulations you had to go through to get where you were today?
Yeah, that's a great question. Great question. I think, all of you here have this unique opportunity to be in the specialized program. And I think a lot of it was going to land on your shoulders around to what degree do you challenge yourself as your school is challenging you, right? The opportunity that you have is that you're surrounded by brilliant people and you're surrounded by teachers who are going to challenge you. And they're asking like, how do you live up to your fullest potential? It's so easy to just like slack back and spend your entire life on social media and Netflix. Like that's become a default state, right? If that's the default state for everybody, how do you shift your own default state to be the best version of yourself? And I think that's something that I experienced going through specialized high school, where you're constantly being challenged, whether it's from your friends and your peers or from your teachers and the administration. Like they want you to be as successful as you can be. And you can define your own version of success, right? Success doesn't mean that you have to make X number of dollars and have a bank account with Y amount of money in it. And that's your version of success. Like success can be whatever you want it to be for yourself. And maybe you want to optimize your life. I'm using algorithmic language right now, but like that's how engineers think around, we're going to build an algorithm, we're going to optimize towards a particular thing. In many ways, life can be, you can look at it as like, what are the patterns? What are the habits? What am I doing every day? Am I doing things every day in my life to be a better version of myself that's bringing me towards my version of success? What does that mean for each and every one of you? Or are you letting life sort of passively happen to you where you're going to just drift into whatever ends up you drift to and call that good? I'm not voicing judgment on any of those paths, but I'm asking you, what direction do you want to be moving your life towards? As you're shaping that path for you right now, as you're building the habits in your life that will give you insight into what path you unfold. So I challenge you all to challenge yourselves. What version, what type of human do you want to be? What type of life do you want to live? And what can you do to set yourself up towards living that life? And I think we made it right on time.
Yes.
Boom. Awesome. Great job, everyone.
So I think this brings us to the conclusion of this. Jeff, I just on behalf of PAMA, our co-moderators in the school community, I want to thank you for taking this past hour to spend with us. Boy, did we get part two of the social dilemma.
Yeah.
As you said, I think the movie, you said, to quote you, the movie lives on, correct? And I can't think of any better assembly that we could ever do for our students around what the concerns are around social media and technology and how to properly use it than you just did for us right now. So we thank you so much for making this time for us today.
Thank you.
Anything we should keep a lookout for in the future of what you're working on next?
No, I want to see what all of these students do. That's what I want to keep a lookout for.
I'm with you on that. That sounds really good. Jeff, my best to your family. Say hello to
Thank you so much.
Staten
Will do.
Island alum. And Jeff, good luck. Be safe and well. And
Thank you.
for spending
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jeff.
And thank you all for joining us today for this special conversation with Jeff Orlowski. I want to thank Adina, Julia, Zach, Satina, and of course, Ms. Palma for all coming together to make this possible today.
Thank you, everybody. Good stuff.
That brings a conclusion to our broadcast. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you.